Your hosts have earned a reputation as fierce and effective advocates inside and outside of the courtroom. Both partners are experienced trial attorneys who have been board certified in family law by the Texas Board of Legal Specialization.
Thanks for tuning in to For Better, Worse, or Divorce, our podcast where we provide you tips and insights on how to navigate divorce and child custody situations in the state of Texas and sometimes outside of it when we have guests on from outside of Texas, like today. I'm Brian Walters. I'm here today with Elise Buie. She's the founder of the Elise Buie Law Group, a family law and estate planning firm in Seattle and surrounding areas in Washington State. You have two family law podcasts, actually, which is interesting. Parenting Buie and Maximum Mom are the two, as well as a resourceful blog with some great info for parents and those recovering from a divorce. And we felt like it'd be a great guest to be on the show today to discuss some frequently asked questions from our listeners and clients, and also just kind of, your experiences and how things are different, or if they're different in Washington State. So briefly, as a background, you and I met through kind of a professional group of other family law and divorce lawyers in the United States and Canada. Kind of have a small group of us that with kind of larger and more successful practices, and we kind of exchange ideas and thoughts and get together a couple times a year. In fact, we're going to do that in about a week and a half, and just try to run a better practice and provide better services for our clients. So give me a little bit about your background, kind of not the boring stuff about, what law journal you were on in law school, but, where you grew up, you have kids, did you do anything before this? All the interesting stuff, not the boring lawyer stuff, if you don't.
Okay. Well, the interesting stuff is I'm from New Orleans. I lived in New Orleans my whole life, so I'm a good Southern New Orleanian. Go LSU. Was that just the best game ever? I'm also an LSU grad. So that was pretty exciting. We have 6 kids. We're a blended family. I have 4 biological kids, 2 bonus daughters. So that has been an adventure to launch 6 children out into the world. I feel like I've educated the planet. So that's kind of fun. We also evacuated from New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina, so I ended up moving a bunch. Georgia, then Minnesota, then Seattle. I've taken 3 bar exams, so I'm like all geared up now. I think I should take the California bar just for kicks to see how that would go. And I, like you said, I do live in the Pacific Northwest. And so something interesting, I actually live out here on the water. And so often I get interrupted by sea lions on things. So when people send me like podcast things like keep your dogs quiet, I'm like, I do not know how to keep the sea lions quiet. So if we hear barking, it is the sea lions, not my dogs.
Well, you're probably, if you're not already, you're probably thinking about sun and warmth this time of the year up there. It's my brother lives in Portland, Oregon, so it's kind of similar concept, and this is about the time of the year where they start wondering about traveling to places with sun. So, but you have much better summers than we have in Texas, so that's probably a fair trade, as you know from being in New Orleans for many summers. So.
Oh yeah, those summers are hot. I mean, I felt like we had to live in the swimming pool, either the swimming pool or the AC. There was nothing in between.
Yeah. I don't know how my ancestors survived they were in South Texas for prior to air conditioning, but somehow they did. Tougher people back then. Well, you have 2 podcasts, not one, which is an interesting idea. And it sounds like just based on the names, it lets you kind of focus on different topics or, kind of different issues. So tell us about those 2 podcasts and, what they're about and when you started them, how long you've been doing them, those kind of interesting things.
Sure. Well, the Maximum Mom podcast, to be honest, I think it started in 2020. It was kind of pandemic related, in the sense of, there were so many women that I was meeting and interacting with who were struggling with the idea of, being a mom, being an attorney, and being an entrepreneur. I mean, I look at that as like the total trifecta. Like, it is intense to do all 3. And anybody who thinks those three jobs together are easy to pull off hasn't tried any one of them. So it is kind of a wild ride. And I think as a mom of many, it was becoming really obvious to me how many moms were struggling with the dynamic of dealing with the different cycles of their life. Like when you have young babies, it looks very different than when you have, elementary age children, high school, college. Like it's all a cycle. And I think just having some really frank conversations with moms about what that looked like and how you could do it successfully really has spurred me on with the Maximum Mom podcast to just kind of bring reality, but also just kind of authentic, the real life stuff that what we're dealing with is really hard. And we can't accomplish everything in a week, though we're all pretty type A as attorneys, we're trying to do all the things. I mean, sometimes if you have a child who's, maybe struggling in school and you're fighting with an IEP team and you're doing all the things you need to do as super mom, maybe you're not going to be super law firm owner that week or that month or that quarter, but really being real about that. The Maximum Mom podcast is truly one of my favorite times of the week to just connect with other people who have gone through this. And interestingly, out of the Maximum Mom podcast kind of came the idea of the Parenting Buie podcast, which more is focused on how to do this job as a parent more successfully, ideally to keep you out of my office and away from divorce. I became really interested in Fair Play, which is a book and card game written by a Harvard educated lawyer named Eve Rodsky. And Fair Play literally brings an operating system into your home. Just like we all have in our offices, we have systems, we have SOPs, we have all those things. But so many of us don't have those in our most important organization, which is our home. And Fair Play literally has revolutionized my life, but it has revolutionized so many people's lives because it allows couples to come together, really divvy up the labor in the home and figure out the total ownership of things. Because, the typical scenario is women do all this mental load where we're planning everything, organizing everything, researching, and then we nag our spouses to go do a few of the tasks. It's very unproductive and it doesn't allow for a good division of labor. So Parenting Buie brings out a lot of the aspects of Fair Play and really hoping to keep people away from divorce. I'd love to go out of the divorce business, because we just don't have any here in Washington. That hasn't happened yet, but I can still be hopeful.
For sure. And you also have a blog, as I understand it. So what do you cover in that, or is that pretty broad?
It is pretty broad. I mean, we really try to answer, probably like you do, a lot of frequently asked questions and a lot of things that people are interested in. I mean, one of my favorite blog posts is from a long time ago. Like I said, we have 6 children. And so, typical kids in college looking for money. And I was like, I'm not giving you money for nothing. I'm like, you can blog for your beers. And so my kids started blogging things about, life in a blended family and life with a stepdad and going through divorce. And so I have one of the blogs is from my oldest son talking about what it was like to be raised in a home with a stepdad. And every time I read that, I am just like, it's so profound to me and it makes me appreciate my husband who has been an amazing stepfather to these kids. So our blog is a mix of things.
Interesting. That's really, from the kids' perspective, when they're grown, that's important. I mean, I know judges are focused on that, let's make this easy on the kids, but I think it's difficult for us as parents, and I'm a parent too, and lawyers, to really understand what that means. So yeah, that's quite the concept. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about kind of focus on women and motherhood, and as you go through, if you're going through a divorce, if you get to that point, or a child custody dispute, whether that's because you're not married to the to the dad, or because you're further litigation, 5 years post-divorce, there's a problem that comes up. So are there certain misconceptions or stereotypes that you find that a lot of moms or women come into your office with about the court system, or do you think most of them have a pretty good sense of things?
I would say there's actually a fair amount of misconception, but it's mostly, in my mind, around the money piece of, they'll say things like, well, I'm going to keep the house, and I'll be able to keep the house. And I'm thinking, well, we live in a community property state, so you can't necessarily keep the house if there's not other funds, to be able to buy out your partner or come up with some other creative solution. And I think even more to the point is the question of, should you keep the house? I think so many people come in with this idea, or at least they verbalize this. I mean, I definitely call people out on it pretty regularly. They're like, well, the kids won't be able to function if they have to move. And I'm like, really? You actually think your kids can't handle, a move to a different home? Because that has not been my experience. Kids are pretty resilient. They're able to move. I mean, yeah, they want to decorate their room and do fun things, but I mean, with enough creativity and the right attitude, kids can move pretty easily. And if keeping the house is going to make you, really cash poor, you have to question whether that's the right move, and really digging in. And so I think one of the things I spend a lot of time with is helping women in particular really get to understand, and not just understand, but know their finances and know how to pull the levers to make their finances work for them. And so, a lot of times I feel like there's education that goes into that. There's meeting with maybe a financial neutral, somebody who specializes in divorce, like a CDFA, and really helping people get comfortable with their numbers. Because I think as a mom and somebody who did go through divorce and, was facing this, single parenting, looking at 4 kids. And I mean, it's why I started my law firm, because I was like, I got kids, that are growing up and they got to go to college. I was like, looks like I'm paying for college. And so, I mean, that was a big deal to me, to be able to figure out, how am I going to fund these kids all to go to school? And so, but I had to really learn my numbers. And I find a lot of women are in that same boat. And I mean, now I find, the numbers are kind of fun. And I mean, I, compete with myself all the time about, can I pull this lever and increase this 5%, 7%, and what can I do? And so helping people see the fun in numbers is an important aspect, I think, of working with women through divorce or even post-divorce, depending on what kind of help they might have gotten initially.
Yeah, yeah, totally makes sense to me. So one of the things I like to talk about with other lawyers is from other states is how things are done in other states, because we are in Texas very distinct in certain ways. Now, first of all, I think there's a lot of similarities. For one thing, I heard you say this: Washington's a community property state, which as is Texas. Is that correct? Did I hear that right?
Yes. Actually, all the states I'm barred in are community property. So I'm kind of Louisiana, Minnesota.
Yeah, and I think that the basic concepts of it are probably, even in states that aren't necessarily quote unquote community property, are probably pretty broad concepts. And I think we probably all have little differences about, this tweak and that issue or this type of thing. I've, talked with California lawyers a bunch, for example, and there's different ways that they handle what we call reimbursement claims or waste claims, but they're basically the same concept of it. But one of the big differences, we have kind of two big differences, I think, in Texas. So I want to kind of get your input on how these things work in Washington. One is that we essentially we technically don't have alimony, but we have something called spousal maintenance, which is a very far cry from what most states have as alimony, number one. And number two, we allow juries, if one side wants to make custody decisions, not judges. So and those tend to be very different than other states. So you want to tell me a little bit about how alimony works in Washington, if you have it, and how custody determinations are made, which I suspect to be contrast with us.
Yeah, definitely. We also, like you, have what's called spousal maintenance. But it is, I mean, it's a pretty robust thing, I would say, here in Washington. I mean, it's an equitable principle. Interestingly, it's not statutory, but it's an equitable principle where we always ask the first question, does one spouse have a need and does the other spouse have an ability to pay? And then we look at the principles of how long the parties have been married. And we look at a short-term marriage, which is like 5 years or shorter, a mid-term marriage, which is usually about 6 years to 15 years. 6 years to about 25 years, and then a long-term marriage, which would be post 25 years. And those lengths of marriage really determine at least the range of what we're looking at for the length of spousal maintenance. I mean, in our jurisdiction, usually short-term marriages, we look to put people back to their position prior to marriage. So we're kind of looking backwards. Midterm marriages, we really look to, usually it's about 1 year of spousal maintenance for every 3 to 5 years of marriage, and it's more rehabilitative. It's like, what can we do to get the spouses on par so they can both kind of be maximizing their financial life moving forward. And then when we're looking to permanent spousal maintenance in that post 25-year marriage, we really are looking to put the spouses in the same financial position till the day they die. They've been married more than 25 years, and the court really looks to that. And so, there's always exceptions, though, as every good lawyer, how we always answer all questions, it depends. So, if I have a client who comes in and they're married 28 years, I am definitely not going to tell them, of course, you're going to have permanent spousal maintenance, no doubt about it, no questions asked, like, don't even worry, why don't you go to the Caribbean for the next 6 months because it's all good. Like, no. We're first going to ask the need question and the ability to pay. And so, there's factors that can preclude things. Like if there is no money, we can't squeeze dollars out of nothing. And so, it just depends on many things, but it is equitable. And the other question about juries, no, we do not have juries in child custody. Our judges here would about have a heart attack. Like they absolutely have all purview in the best interest of the child. We use experts often, either guardian ad litems or parenting evaluators. And much of my career has been spent as a guardian ad litem, doing a lot of guardian ad litem work. And in a lot of exceedingly high conflict cases, where we've had trials and I've been on the stand for days and days on end being cross-examined. And so it is, it can be a very highly contentious process. When we're looking at parenting plans and coming up with a residential schedule. But, as somebody who has been intimately involved in that process when it is high conflict, I am probably one of the stronger voices in you do not want to go to court over your custody determination, if at all possible. It is not what is in the best interest of your children, the conflict that comes with that. And anything you can do, in my mind, to use alternative dispute resolution or alternative dispute professionals like a parenting coordinator, a parent coach, a divorce coach, where we can keep you away from court and you can make decisions as a couple, I'm all for, because it's the conflict that harms these children, not usually the result, but it is the process that is very difficult on children.
Good. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me for sure. Well, we've got some questions from listeners that are, some of them are Texas specific, but most of them are pretty broad. And in fact, even the ones that are Texas specific, it'd probably be interesting to see if there's a different answer in that you'd have there. So let me run through a few of those, and that might lead to a couple other questions. But so one of the questions is, how can I continue to be a stay-at-home mom for our 3 children after a divorce? And so this is basically an alimony question, essentially. So, and also I'll answer it from a Texas perspective. So the short answer is that you're going to that's a financial question for the most part, right? How can you afford to do that, right? That's the question. So in Texas, your options are more limited because we typically don't have a lot of alimony. So there are cases where you might qualify for it, number one. Number two, you might be in a position where your settlement of funds is enough that you will be able to chew into those assets over a period of time until you can get yourself back on your feet financially to enable you to do that. Let's say you need $100,000 a year, and you've got $300,000 in assets as part of the settlement, but no alimony. You could say, well, I'm going to spend 3 years being a stay-at-home mom, and then hopefully be by year 4 in a position to continue to do that, either through remarriage or employment or starting a business or something like that. So I assume the answer on your end might be a little bit different and probably revolve around alimony. Am I correct about that?
It would be different in the sense, first I would ask, what is the need, and then what is the other spouse's ability to pay. But even a deeper question is, have you sat down with your soon-to-be ex and really talked about what it's going to look like if you do go to work full-time, and what is that going to look like for them? And obviously without knowing what we're talking about, but if you're a stay-at-home mom and that is something that you two decided that was the best for your family, and maybe you have a husband who earns really good money, and maybe him taking care of the children 50% of the time would be a real burden. And so having that conversation and talking about what makes the most sense for your family, and that is where bringing in a neutral professional, like a parenting coach, because there are many, many men in particular who I have worked with who are thrilled for their spouse to stay at home for a few years and care for the children so they can continue on whatever their career trajectory is. But that's a real decision you're making, and it does have financial implications. And now in the world of remote work, there's a lot that you could do around being a stay-at-home mom. Our entire firm is remote. So, I employ dozens of people who are moms who work, full-time, some part-time. They decide their schedule, but it's fully remote. So they're able to really enjoy kind of the best of both worlds. So I would make sure that, when you're thinking about this issue and you're talking to professionals about this, you're really thinking outside the box, and you're not just focused on, am I getting alimony? Am I not? Do I have dollars? Really looking at this from a holistic perspective, because it's a big decision for the family.
I 100% agree. Okay, so next one is, how do I hire an attorney when my spouse has control of the finances? So this marriage, obviously, since they're referring to a spouse. So in Texas, at least, we don't have legal separation. That's another big difference. So even though someone splits up or they file for divorce, you're still married. And so all income and all assets, community assets at least, but potentially even outside of those, are under the court's control, and the court can divide them out. So typically what a court would do in that situation is, you would need to find a lawyer that would say, okay, look, I won't take a large retainer like I typically would have, but, hey, you'd want to identify an account, right? So you would say, look, we've got a savings account with $80,000 in it, in both of our names. That didn't exist before the marriage. And that's been sitting there for 6 months. So there's, in that case, the court would probably say, okay, well, you can have 40 of it. You can give some of it to your lawyer if you want to. Another option in Texas would be to borrow, either through credit cards or friends or family, with the idea that you would be able to get that refunded back to those folks that you borrowed it from, either quickly through that kind of situation or at the end of the case. So typically courts are going to try to make sure both people have access to funds, both for their living expenses, child expenses, and for attorney fees. They're usually pretty good about that. They're not quite as diligent about it as I'd like to see in certain courts. I think sometimes judges think if I just give a bunch of people that just filed a divorce a bunch of money, then they're going to go a little crazy and fight and spend it, and which I don't really think is the judge's. It's not the judge's money; it's their money, and I think they should be able to do what they want to with it. But I think that's usually the thought process. But generally, they're going to try to ensure relative equality and the ability to pay an attorney. What about in Washington? How does that work?
I would say it's pretty similar, and even more to the point of the court will again look to a need and ability, and so they will sometimes, immediately we can go in on temporary orders very, very immediately and seek a payment of a certain amount of attorney's fees, 10,000, 20,000. And if, one spouse has that ability to pay, or the community has that ability, the court will just order that outright. And often, it won't even be part of the community where we're going to look to divvy it up evenly later. They'll just make sure that people have some money initially to be able to hire counsel and move forward. And same like if the case hasn't been like adjudicated, the money is all theirs. And if somebody comes to us and, if their both names are on any account, we would tell them 50% of that is yours. So feel free to take 50% out, not, a penny more than 50%. But you're fine to do that. And obviously we'd want records and of when the bank account opened and all that kind of stuff. But assuming it is community property, very clearly, we wouldn't hesitate telling somebody, that they could take that money out and be able to use it. And just like you, a lot of times people look to, credit cards or friends and family, because we as lawyers really should not be the bank of our clients. I think that brings up a lot of ethical considerations that, we have to stay away from.
Yeah, I agree. It's, that's what I tell my clients. I want to be your lawyer, not your credit manager, right? That's a problem. You end up in that situation sometimes, but you try to avoid it. I agree with you 100% on that. Okay, so two more quick ones and then we'll wrap up here. So what happens in the event my spouse and I reconcile? So again, in Texas, we don't have legal separation. So in that case, it's really if you could either just drop the divorce and it's like it never happened, or you could leave it open, especially if you had an agreement and say try it out for 3 to 6 months. The percentage success for reconciling spouses over the long term is not high, but it happens. And so, that's probably wise to maybe not immediately drop everything and have to start over if things don't work out in 3 months. You might just say time out. But what about y'all? You might have some legal ramifications with legal separation and whatnot that we don't have.
Well, and a lot of people don't do a legal separation here. We can file a legal separation, which would be different than a divorce. And then we can later turn that separation into a divorce. But a person who is divorcing doesn't have to file for separation. They can stay together in the same home and just file for divorce. So I, like you, would probably talk to them about, the realities of reconciliation and what that can look like. And because of the money and the timing, that becomes an issue here. We have a 90-day waiting period for which you can't get a divorce in the first 90 days. So let's say they reconcile on day 30, but we're not certain about that. I'm probably not going to tell them to go drop their, divorce filing. They might just hold on to it, see what happens, and, we'll deal with it on the back end if need be, if there's, been some type of issue. Because one of the main issues for us would be the date the community ends, because oftentimes that date of separation is the date that we look to as the end of the community. And so there can be implications of earnings, and we live in tech wondrous area where people get all these stock units and things. And so often they'll want to file and they'll want their date of separation. They'll be rabid about that date of separation because, they're about to get $500,000 in stock from Amazon and they do not want that part of their community. And so, there's often more to the issue than the reconciliation. So, we have to oftentimes pull up that rug and look and see what are we really dealing with here.
All right, one more quick question, then we'll wrap it up. So question is, I had two DWIs before my kids were even born. Can those kind of past mistakes be used against me? So I think this is the implication is in a custody case, married or not, might depend a little bit on how much before the kids were born, hopefully not while you were pregnant. But let's assume not. Let's assume it was, 5 years before your kids were born and you've got a, 3 and 4 year old. So something like that. So my experience with that is that that in and of itself isn't going to get you and make you lose custody or something like that. It will be a red flag though, right? So the judge is going to figure that there is a alcohol problem in your history here, and also kind of judgment problems. Those are really two separate problems, although they go hand in hand often. And so I think the court's going to be looking at what's your drinking history been since then. Do you continue to drink? Has there been any further problems with alcohol use? Has there been any problems with judgment calls, right? Bad decisions that don't necessarily involve alcohol. So red flag, but not, I don't think, determinative if there's nothing significant following up on it. Is I think our courts mostly want to believe in redemption, but with caution. It's sort of the old trust but verify thing from the Cold War. Sort of the same thing we have. That's a typical thought process from what I found in judges here. What about in Washington?
I would agree, and it's funny, I would have said the exact same sentence, the trust but verify. The only caveat I would say is if there's any allegations of current drinking, that's going to be, a huge thing. Like, it is going to pile on bigger than you think it's going to pile on. So, any thought of getting rid of those past things, you really must have gotten rid of it. Like, it's got to be only in the past. Because if there's any allegation of current issues and you have a spouse who's like, all into fighting, I mean, this is going to be an easy thing, to be able to prove that, things are still awry if they've got, pictures of you drinking, or they've got text messages that are just, you clearly drunk, and doing things that are not great. It's going to be an easy sell that there's a big problem. And obviously I think in all jurisdictions, I mean, the best interest of the child rules the day. And if a judge thinks that you are going to potentially drive drunk with a child, that is going to be a no-go.
Absolutely. So, okay, well, very good. Well, thank you. That's all we have for today. If you like what you've heard today, please do us a favor and leave a review. We appreciate all your feedback since it helps us better the podcast. If you'd like to reach out to Elise directly, we'll have her contact information listed in the description. We'll list the links to your two podcasts as well and your blog. And we can't thank you enough for joining us. We'll be back with another episode in a week or two. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
For information about the topics covered in today's episode and more, you can visit our website at waltersgilbreth.com. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of For Better, Worse, or Divorce, where we post new episodes every first and third Wednesday. Do you have a topic you want discussed or a question for our hosts? Email us at podcast@waltersgilbreth.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time.